Please introduce yourself and off to the races.
Taylor, I swear I've known Taylor for 15 years, but he looked just this age 15 years ago. I don't know how he does it. So my
So,
name's Jared Zemp. I am originally from Canada, but living in Salt Lake City for the last 20 or so years. And we actually, way back my junior year at BYU, I launched a math boot camp for college kids. And and that got boring after a few years. And I tried to sell it to investors, and nobody was interested in a little math tutoring company. And so we actually started offering in-house financing, and we'll get to that toward the end of the conversation. But um, it turns out the investors were not interested in buying into a tutoring company, but they were very interested in buying high interest rate student loan financial contracts. And so we were able to attract just over $1 million worth of capital by selling these financial contracts. And then we use that money to go on an ETA binge, entrepreneurship through acquisition. And we went after 18 companies in 18 months. And 10 of those were flat out acquisitions. Five of them were launches that were based on our acquisitions. And then three of them we actually brought under management through contract, where we took options on equity, on a controlling interest, or on the entire company, and that actually ended up being our best strategy. But we'll get to that. So that's my background. We overall, that was what, 2012 through about 2018 when we wrapped up that portfolio. So it was about a 6 year stretch, and oh my gosh, we've got stories to tell. We've got- it was a wild, wild time. But after we kind of honed in our strategy, we got to the point where we were actually taking, on average, between one and $200,000 in cash to the table every time we bought a company. Okay, so let that sink in a bit. We bought a company and they gave us money. Okay, so I want to tell you how we did that and how we got to that point, because I think that there was about 5 years in there where we were experimenting with a lot of stuff that didn't work, and we got to the one thing that did work. And so um, the way that we ended up doing that was by identifying a target company, and then we would start due diligence. And it was probably about 20 or 30 companies that we would look at before we would say, this looks like a good fit. And we would get into the due diligence process. We would take that due diligence, which was often very messy. The companies we were targeting were anywhere between a million and about 3 million in sales a year. Um, and they'd bring us their due diligence, and it was often really messy. Their books were always a disaster, whether they knew it or not. And they often had not nailed down their marketing strategy. Oftentimes, that was kind of like the owner's bank account, right? That if cash got tight, then they'd just pull it out of the marketing budget. And so they didn't have a lot of consistent marketing numbers typically. They didn't have a typical, sales strategy. It was often just, the owner handles it. Um, and so these small business acquisition targets, we were looking for companies that were as clean as possible. We would take that due diligence, and then we would run it through our team. And our team consisted of management consultants, attorneys, and accountants. And we'd go through the due diligence as well as we could, and try to identify any issues. And there were always issues. So it wasn't a question of finding a clean company. It was a question of finding a company we could live with. Then we would, and not just that we could live with, but that we could feel comfortable representing to investors that this was a good investment. Okay. And that's important, because we would take those due diligence packages, we would have the investors sign NDAs, and then we would relay the due diligence, sometimes, redacting any identifiable information, usually redacting identifiable information, and show it to investors. And investors would get excited about small businesses because the returns, if it works, are astronomical. They're about double what you'd get in the stock market. So to kind of give you an idea, we were buying companies at the 2 to 3x mark, right? So if they were making $100,000 a year, we were buying them at two to $300,000 a year, if that's their profit. Um, the thing is, that's for an owner operated company. That's a normal valuation for an owner operated company. Um, for an absentee owned company, 4 to 5x is normal. And so when we would buy them at the owner operated price. But when we're quoting them to investors, we're quoting it at the absentee owned price because our investors weren't going to come in and manage the company. We were going to manage the company. And so um, we were quoting to investors a price that was 4 or 5 times. So we'll go back to that example of $100,000 in profit. We're buying it at 2 to 300,000 and we're selling it to investors at the $400,000 to $500,000 valuation mark. Then we're also negotiating with the owner to give us some seller financing. And at first that was optional. But as we brought some of these companies into the portfolio, we quickly realized that there was mass misrepresentation. That's a kind way of saying they were lying to us. Often unintentionally, if I'm being entirely honest. It wasn't just that they were lying to us to make more money. It was also that a lot of times these small business owners were really good at running their business, and we made the mistake of underestimating them a lot of times. We would get in and say, "Oh, how hard can it be to run a carpet cleaning company?" Right? It turns out it's actually really hard. you know and these guys really are good at what they're doing, but they're not experts at finance, and they're not experts at legal, and they're definitely not experts at tech. And so a lot of times we would get in there and find that things have been fundamentally misrepresented, and often unintentionally. um, and so we began requiring that every deal we did had some seller financing that we could come and claw back from if we came in and found massive, misrepresentation. And by that I mean, misrepresentation that fundamentally would have affected the valuation or would have affected our purchasing decision. And that way we have a pool of money that we can still claw back from if we need to. Now you better believe that that didn't make people happy when we did that, but occasionally it was necessary. So to run through this, kind of put the numbers front and center. $100,000 cash flow. Our average was 2.5x. So we would buy for 250,000 at the owner operated valuation. The absentee valuation would be about 500,000. We would sell 50% of that to the investors. Okay. So we would sell it to them for 250,000. Now you're noticing that that price matches, right? So we're buying for 250,000 for 100% of the company, and we're selling at 250,000 for 50% of the company. And that spread there is where we made our money. We would end up owning 50% of the company, but we would also have the seller financing. So if we gave them $150,000 cash up front, on a $250,000 raise from investors, we end up with $100,000 in cash that we can then use to update or upgrade the company, to pay management, to pay. We didn't ever. Earlier I said take the money off the table. We didn't ever just pull the money out and go to Mazatlan or something. We would reinvest that 100,000 back into the company, but it gave us some capital to actually do our work with. Um, so let's pause there for a second. I see that we've had a good number of questions, and let's see where we're at. Taylor brought up that finding the dashboard on this thing is always a nightmare. Let me see if I can figure out where to get my comments here. Maybe not. Maybe we'll have to do
Questions
that
in
at
the
the end.
chat yet, Jared? Just some comments.
Oh, okay.
But
All
if
right.
people have questions about the process that Jared's going through, please throw them in the chat, and then I can manage those, Jared, as we go along.
Perfect. Any questions to this point? We good so far?
I have a question.
Sure.
I joined just a smidge late, but the difference between owner operated and absentee owned is really the key in your ability to get that cash ahead. Can you again describe how you can purchase at an owner-operated valuation and sell to investors with an absentee owned within that framework?
So we would take the due diligence documents that we got from the target company and use that to communicate with investors. What we wouldn't communicate to investors is our purchase price. That's proprietary. And what we would communicate is the financials of the company and our plans for what we hope to do with it. Oftentimes, there were also synergies with other companies in our portfolio that we felt would add a lot of value to the company. And so there was really two aspects. One was that they were selling, expecting the buyer to manage it, and really we were the buyer and we are managing it. And so that's not a misrepresentation. But when we go to investors, the investors themselves are not coming in and managing it. And so their expectation of the valuation is at the absentee owned price. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
So we'd come out with $100,000 cash. We'd reinvest it in the company. We'd use that to get it off the ground and hire whoever we needed to. A lot of times that's honestly the first thing we would do is put up a fresh coat of paint somewhere, anywhere, because a lot of times just the smell and the process got the team in a mind frame of change and a mind frame of progress. And so a lot of times that was a real key psychological factor to bringing the team on board of the company we just acquired was just throwing up paint. And I know it's weird, but what we found was that the smell of fresh paint got people in the mindset for positive change. So a lot of this was all about timing, right? I mean, and we were able to play with the timing with this part here, with the $150,000 cash down on a $250,000 purchase. By delaying that 100,000 of payments that came out actually out of the profits of the company over time, we were able to carve out this operating budget that we could then dedicate to the company. And I call this the Costco principle. And I gather it's not net 60 anymore. Now it's more like net 30, but because business owners got upset. But the principle here is float. And if this is a concept you're familiar with, this is probably the most powerful concept in small business or big business that I think you can bring to bear. Um, so Costco actually brings product in the door but doesn't pay for that product for about 60 days. But they'll only bring in enough inventory that what they can sell through in a single week. So they only bring in what they can sell in 1 week. So you start doing the math on that, and you realize they're collecting 8 weeks at retail prices of cash, right? So 8 weeks they have cash coming in before their first bill comes due. And when that bill comes due, they now have to pay for 1 week, but they're not paying retail price, they're paying wholesale price. And so Costco brags and brags and brags, hey, we only have a 2% margin. And that's true. But what they have is an enormous amount of cash in the bank because their vendors end up being their bank. And they're able to create this massive float, this massive pool of cash um, that they can then invest and make money off the investment, that they can use for advertising, that they can use for operating. I mean, so Costco, even though they're only making 2%, has an enormous bank account. So, like, I think you can take that same principle and apply it to these companies, both in terms of acquisition, but also in terms of your operations. And that actually is exactly my takeaway at the end of all of this. You know, of setting up 5 managing companies and launching or purchasing 18 companies in 18 months, is that the single greatest thing we came away with was that finance was the answer in almost every case. It was the answer for how we purchased the companies. It was the answer for how we were able to create our own $100,000 float to cover management and upgrades. But it was also the answer way back when When I when we started and I told you, hey, I started that math school and we did these student loans. And the way we got capital to start buying businesses in the beginning was that we sold those student loans for $1.2 million. And so now that I've wrapped up that portfolio, that's exactly what I'm working on. I've started an app called Transfer Credit, xfercredit.com, and we help businesses create in-house financing programs. And that lets them get more sales at a higher price, so they don't have to discount in order to sell at a higher price. Now they can take a down payment, stretch it out over a financing contract. You earn interest on those payments. And then you also get to plan more predictable cash flow. For a small business owner, that's the difference between being able to sleep at night. And ultimately, in the end, that's how we were able to attract investors on an ugly little company that did math tutoring, right? Was by selling those financing contracts. And anyway, reach out. I'd love to help you. The due diligence process on acquiring these companies is tricky, and there's a lot of landmines that you don't know until you step on them. And so I'd love to help you through the process. I'd love to talk to you about either financing the acquisition or financing your operations along the way.
Thanks, Jared.
Taylor?
Fantastic presentation. Really appreciate it. There are a few questions in the chat. One from Patrick McMillan. What types of investors were you raising from? What was the profile?
It started with the people who bought our financing contracts. So those the same group of investors then said, "Hey, these are good, clean contracts. We're seeing a reliable return. What else have you got for us?" And that's when we said, "Hey, our primary investment strategy is to take these financing, take in-house financing to companies that really need it." Because a lot of small businesses, about one in three, would seriously benefit from in-house financing, but they just don't know how to do it. They don't know how to pull the credit. They don't know how to structure the plans. They don't know how to issue the documents. They don't know how to process the payments or collect when things go bad. And they certainly don't know how to go out and find investors to buy those contracts. And so uh, we were looking for companies that were a good fit for in-house financing when we went out looking for acquisitions. And so it was a real good marriage between our existing investors um, and this kind of investment thesis. From there, it kind of branched out into other companies that didn't necessarily require in-house financing. But by then, we'd kind of developed a track record, and it was a lot easier when we said, "Yeah, we're out buying small businesses," and 4 or 5x price tag still means a 20 to 25% return on investment. It's double the stock market. So, yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah. Um,
Was that
BJ
Patrick?
asked, oh,
Thanks,
yeah,
Patrick.
he gave a thumbs up. BJ asked, for those of us not looking for investors as part of our acquisition, what do you suggest? Use a buyer side broker? And is there any real value in these so-called coaches online, or is it just a cash grab on their end?
Well, oh, here's the thing. It's an 80-20 rule. 80% of the brokers that we've rubbed shoulders with are total garbage. They don't know what they're doing. They started out as commercial real estate brokers. For most states, that's the requirement to broker businesses is that you have a commercial real estate license. Those things have very little to do with each other. And so the vast majority of business brokers that I've worked with are not good at their job. They shouldn't be doing it. But being in commercial real estate, they come across businesses that should sell or are in a position to sell. And so they start listing. And so, should you use a broker? I am a big believer that a broker is worth their weight in gold if you have a good one. They'll help you avoid pitfalls. They'll help you see good companies. They'll introduce you to investors that you or yeah, sometimes investors, but also sellers that are a really good fit for your personality and for your team and for your investment profile. So yeah, should you work with a broker? Yes. Should you work with any broker? Absolutely not. How's that for giving you an answer both ways?
That's good. I'm imagining that the next question is, will you share Any good brokers that you've worked with? So if that's the case, you
Here's
can.
the problem. The good ones are hard to find and they make a boatload of money, so they retire quickly.
All right,
and,
that's fair.
and a lot of times they come across a screaming deal that it just looks right, and then they hop in. One of the best brokers that I know here in Utah, he was in the industry for 5 years, and now he has a Lambo collection because he started buying FedEx routes early on because he was like, these are undervalued and they're easy to run, and there's no reason why I shouldn't be hopping in on this myself. And so, yeah, the good ones, you got to grab them while they're there, and then and hang on to them as long as you can. I just got off the phone with one. I had a guy call me and say, "Hey, I've got $5 million to place in a small business. What do you suggest?" And I said, "Let me call a broker friend of mine." And he answered the bed. He's out of surgery for a total of 2 hours. This is why he's so good at his job, right? He answered the phone from his hospital bed, and he's like, "We got just the things for you, but I'm gonna have a partner call you back." And I said, "No, Chuck, I want to work with you, man." And he says, "Well, my doctor says I have to hang up because I got to go for some more X-rays." So, yeah, yeah. Good luck. Good luck finding a good one. But I can make some introductions. I just don't know if they're still doing the work at the stage.
Awesome. I think both Carmen and Matt asked, is there a certain type of business that's easier to acquire for beginners?
Absolutely. Education companies, service companies that don't require a lot of assets. But I'd say my caveat to that is that you have to be a leader and a person, right? People person, a person. You because service businesses are all about the team. So if you can get in and win the hearts and minds of the people, the margins are a lot higher, and the every aspect of business is easier in a lot of ways in service businesses if you're good at people. If you're bad at people, you should 100% look at manufacturing or product, where it's much more about processes than it is about the people involved. If you know about yourself that, if we were talking about it in our group, after 25 years of business, if you don't have a lot of friends, a lot of professional contacts, that's your sign. That's your sign that you should buy a product company instead of a service company. Does that help?
That's a good litmus test. I think a good follow up is Brian Mangelson's question: how did you get the deal flow for those types of companies or those small businesses?
Oh my gosh, that was not the problem. Deal flow was easy. We called up brokers and said, "Hey, we're buying," and they just started beating down our door. We put out word to family and friends and professional contacts, "Hey, we're buying," and every one of them had a cousin or an aunt or an ex. Don't do those. Or an ex that was selling their business, and it turns out there's a lot of burnout in small business. That's actually why we started transfer credit. So much burnout, so much uneven cash flow. It's hard running a small business. And so almost any small business owner with a bit of burnout is excited at the opportunity to sell. And so sometimes we would just, we're eating lunch or something, and we'd overhear somebody chatting, and we'd say, "Hey, we're buying businesses. Are you thinking of selling?" And the answer is always yes. It's always yes. So deal flow is not hard.
Hmm. Um, Danny Cruz asked about whether this methodology that you went through is scalable for larger companies that may have a financing problem, like an example being a manpower company with 6,000 staff that's already gone down the factoring path.
Oof, that's tough. That is a tough one. But the answer is yes. Right now, there is a lot of money. There's a big disconnect. There's a lot of money looking to get into the ETA space. I'm seeing about a new fund every week of ETA investors. They are sold on the concept. What they can't find is good targets. And so the question is, um, how do you turn yourself into a good target? And at what price does that actually make sense? Um, a lot of these ETA investors are saying, how can I come in and use AI to fundamentally renovate the company? I'm the new owner. I can lay off a third of the staff and replace them with artificial intelligence. Um, so is this methodology scalable? 100% yes. I've seen it work at all different scales. This is exactly how companies do it, all the way to the highest level of high finance. It just hasn't often been done in small business. Um, so yeah, Danny, I'd love to talk to you more about the specifics there, but the short answer is yes.
You mentioned something there, Jared, about AI. What is your suggestion for someone who would be buying a business in terms of how to implement AI effectively into a newly purchased company?
The best answer that I've come across for that is to not do it yourself. And I understand that's counterintuitive because AI is all about letting the business owner DIY everything, right? And I'm all about DIY as a business owner. That makes a lot of sense to me. But um, having AI implemented correctly and quickly pays for itself in just a couple of weeks. And so I've been working with some AI implementation partners that are really good, and I've become a 100% convert that it makes way more sense to bring in a team. It'll cost you five or $10,000, and that is way cheaper than even one employee. And so, yeah, my suggestion is you hire a good integration team that'll come in and do a good job for you while you're running the business. And if they set it up correctly to begin with, it's really easy to roll out additional apps, additional ways for it to integrate with your company. But it's all about that getting that first seed, training your context and your memory of your AI to really be ready to scale. And a lot of business owners don't do that. They don't do that original context, that original memory. They just start trying to pile apps on, and that's really phase two or phase three. So it really makes sense to do it right the first time from the beginning with somebody who knows what they're doing. They're worth their weight in gold, and then you can roll forward from there on your own, or let them help you add apps to the whole environment.
That's good advice. If if you were to define the profile of a company for a first-time ETA, like a buyer, a new person getting into this first time, what would the profile look like, and how would you filter those deals? Is it a 25-year-old company that has been operating forever, or a 3-year-old business that um, has the burnout? Like, how would you approach the profile of of a company that would be good to purchase?
Oh, I don't like companies for ETA that have a lot of equipment, because equipment breaks down. Equipment means that you got to come to the table with a lot of cash to buy the equipment out. Um, Sometimes the equipment can be used really well in an SBA loan situation, so that would be my exception. Um, that's one of the reasons why I really like service companies. But the single greatest factor is your own expertise. Buy something that you actually understand. You don't have to be an expert, but it's got to be something where you feel like you can actually know if the guy is just flat out lying to you. Um, like I was working out like crazy. You wouldn't know it to look at me at the time, but and I went and started buying these boutique high-end gyms, and and it was about 2 months in where I was like, something doesn't make sense. I know these guys from the gym, and they are paying, but I'm not seeing their payments. And it turns out our gym manager was skimming off the top. He was using his own credit card processor for some of the private clients, but not all of them. He would like rotate. And one of the private clients called me and said, "Hey, I just wanted you to know a different company ran my card this time. I just thought you might want to look into it." That's how I found out. And it was only because I had a personal connection to the people there, and I had an intimate understanding of how private gyms work. So I would say your first criteria is something you understand. Your second criteria is something that's not super capital intensive, preferably something without without equipment. And your third criteria is, will they accept seller financing? Um, and that is a deal breaker for me. And I understand that means you're looking at fundamentally different companies. And sometimes it means the companies are a little more distressed. But the reason that's a deal breaker is I need a pool of capital to pull from when I get in there and I find out, oh, wait a minute. You actually were making this true story, 100% true. I bought a used furniture shop. Couldn't figure out why they were making consistently $7,000 a month profit more than me. And we dumped money into marketing and sales, and we put up the new paint, dang it. And it turns out we didn't know how the furniture had been used. We opened up our storage unit and found the old owner with two women, toys on the shelves, prices on the wall. It turns out used furniture shop was actually laundering money for his bordello. And that's why we couldn't keep up with profit. You know, and so having money to claw back is absolutely vital. We never looked at a company that hadn't been in business at least 5 years. And we didn't like companies that were doing under $1 million in sales. Sometimes we would dip a little lower. I think our smallest one was 600,000. No, that's not true. We did some strategic purchases of smaller companies that we could just kind of bolt on to our existing portfolio companies. That was when we made an exception there.
Awesome. Well, we're at quarter two. Jared, thank you so much. This was super interesting. Hopefully, all of you have been able to get his contact information if you'd like to reach out. But really appreciate the education, Jared, and I would encourage everyone who's interested to connect with Jared. So
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. We'll see you all next week. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Jared. Very exciting presentation.
Thanks, Danny. We'll talk soon. Bye now.